quality of service-based service selection in cloud computing. The work is actually part of my PhD student, Mona Isa. She completed her PhD last year, and also my colleague, Dr. Kashinath Basu. So we are working on this project. The outline of the talk is I'll start with the basic concept of what selection is in different applications, different domains, to set the scene for the problem, and then move toward the cloud computing in general and the service selection problem in the cloud computing. Sorry. What are the main challenges of service selection in clouding, and what are the main factors that need to be considered? And then the second part will be our research work, the framework, the system we have developed for the cloud service selection. So I'll explain the cloud infrastructure, the representation of the quality of service attributes, the algorithms we have used and developed, and the service selection tool or the prototype system, which we call it Sahab. So that's my student, she gave this name, and Sahab, I think in Arabic is cloud. Okay. And at the end, I will explain some of the direction for the future research in the cloud service selection. So if you look at the selection, to set a scene that people select different things in different ways for different purposes. So if people have to buy clothes, they look at the type of the clothes, the design of the clothes, the brand of the clothes, the material of the clothes, and of course, the price of the clothes. So there are various factors or various attributes that are involved in selecting even these clothes. Even if you look at simple example of groceries, somebody is buying some household groceries, so vegetable, for example. So there are selection elements involved, the quality, the type, the prices of the vegetable, and so on. Similarly, if you look at the selection in mobile phones, so there are various factors that need to be considered when selecting or buying mobile phone. Number one is actually the type of phone people buy. What's the make of the phone? What's the specification of the phone? What's the memory? What's the operating system? And so on. What is the network provider, for example? So there are various factors, various attributes to consider in selecting or buying the mobile phone. And similarly, in buying, for example, computer or laptops, to check the specification of the computer, what's the price, what's the design, what's the brand, what's the software services, and so on. If you look at the selection aspect in other services like utility services, well, cloud is sometimes called utility computing, so I take this example to explain it. The electricity, the gas, the water, all these utility services in different countries, they are provided by different service providers. For example, this is kind of the list in the UK. There are many of these companies that provide all these utility services. And again, in choosing the utility services, one has to consider, for example, the prices of the electricity per month, per 3 months, per year, whatever the unit they use, the quality or the reputation of the provider, the customer services, and so on. The same is true for the gas utility services, for the water utility services, and so on. So then comes to the cloud computing. That cloud computing is also sometimes called the utility computing. And most of you will know what the cloud computing is, but I'll kind of reiterate the definition of cloud computing, that it is an infrastructure or IT infrastructure which provides on-demand access to services. Services can be hardware and software, so they can be flexibly provided or provisioned and released, okay, which is the main quality of the cloud, the elasticity aspect. So cloud computing provides various services to user, for example, hardware services, software application, and data. I will explain these further in the coming slides. The service or cloud service is defined by a researcher. For example, this definition, I took it from Jensen et al., that cloud service is defined as a service, can be software, can be hardware, which is hosted or reside on the remote cloud infrastructure and that is made available to customer, consumer, or user over the internet using different provisioning models, such as the SaaS, which is the software as a service, the platform as a service, the PaaS, and the IaaS, the infrastructure as a service. So there are various factors that need to be considered when somebody is selecting cloud services. Okay, for example, if individual want to move or select some cloud services, or any company or organization want to move their IT infrastructure to cloud computing, so the first thing they need to consider how to select services, what kind of services they need, hardware services, software services, both hardware and software application, etc. So they need to specify their requirements. Okay, so main factors to consider: the cloud services, the cloud providers, and the requirements are the quality of service attributes, which for short it is denoted as QoS. The complexity or challenge in cloud service selection is, number one, if we look at the cloud services, cloud computing provide a number of services: the hardware, software, networking, virtualization, data storage, and so on. I listed some of them. For example, memory and CPU, the disk and storages, the networking, data virtualization, software services, web hosting, email, document sharing, video conferencing, and many other. So the first factor is to see what are the services required, and these are the representation of the services at very high level. Okay, but you can go into the detail in, for example, the specification of the memory, the specification of the CPU, the networking, and so on. So there are quite few details into it, but I represented these services at the very high level of abstraction. Second thing, if you look at the cloud provider, there are many cloud providers in the world, in 100 or maybe 1,000 of them. For example, the main cloud provider, the cloud vendors are the Amazon Web Services, which is one of the main player of cloud computing provider. Then the Google Cloud, then the Rackspace, there is Intel, there is the Microsoft Azure, there is the Salesforce, Adobe Creative Cloud, IBM Cloud, Tencent, SAP Cloud, Alibaba, Dropbox. So I listed some of them, but there are many others of them. Okay, there is a long list of cloud provider, and different cloud provider will provide different services, or they may provide same services, but of course with different quality of service. So the third factor to consider in the quality in the service selection are the quality of service attributes. Just some information about the cloud market share. I mean, I took it from the website called Statista, that as you can see, the Amazon is the major player with 33% of cloud computing providers. So Amazon is not just selling online things, but it is one of the main technology provider. Then is the Azure, the Cloud, Google Cloud, and the Alibaba, the IBM, Tencent, Oracle. So this information is from the Statista. Maybe some other websites, some other agencies provide different kind of information. So as you can see, that these are the major player in cloud computing, and they're providing different services. The third main factors are the QoS attributes, or the quality of service attributes, or factors you can call it, or requirements. So I listed some of them. For example, what is the performance of particular cloud service? If some company organization has to move their services to the cloud, okay, they need to consider how efficient is to access, for example, their services, their software, when the service is hosted in the cloud as compared to their local infrastructure in the company, in their own computer system, and so on. Similarly, how reliable the cloud services are, what are the security aspects, what kind of security they can provide, what are the privacy aspects, what are the usability aspects, how easy it is used to the cloud services to use it. Okay, what are the availability, okay, the uptime and downtime of the services, what are the prices, of course, what are the recovery aspect, what happens if there is any failures, okay, what are the throughputs which are low, related, of course, to the performance aspect. What are the scalability? That if company need more resources, for example, if the company grows, they need more IT resources. Is it easy that cloud services are scalable and so on. So these are some of the main quality of service attributes that need to be considered when selecting cloud services. So it is easier maybe to take into account, for example, one factor or two factor, but if you consider many factors, then things or the selection become quite complicated. Suppose if some cloud provider claim that they provide cheap services, okay, they have say open some cloud center with some computer, few PC in the garden shed or the shed of the garden, and they say this is cheap. Of course, it will be cheap, but one need to consider or think about it. What are the other aspects to consider? Is it secure? Is it reliable? Is it performance-wise efficient? Or is it just cheap? Okay. So just taking into account just one factor, one quality of service attribute is not sufficient. Now, the challenge is there are many cloud services, as I just showed you in the previous slide. There are many cloud providers, as we just seen them, and there are many quality of service attribute to consider. So how to take all these into account? Different cloud services from different cloud provider with different quality of service attributes. So that make the cloud service selection problem quite challenging. And on the top of that, what if the user, the people who want to buy, the people who want to select, whether individual people are employees in the company, CEO of the company, any other person in the company, if they don't know the technical aspect of the cloud, okay, which most people they don't know. For example, the requirement about the CPU, the requirement about the data, requirement about the network bandwidth, and so on. So these things make all these factors make things quite service selection quite complicated. Now, what we have done as a part of this work is to take into account all these three factors, and also the user aspect, the user knowledge, user understanding of the cloud computing technology, and develop an approach to select cloud services based on the quality of service attributes. So there are various components or various building blocks to our research work. I'll explain each of them, but at very high level of abstraction, because I will not have time to go into the detail of each and every part of our work. But at the end of the my slide, I listed some of the paper which we have published as part of this work. So people who are interested in this work, then they can read those papers for further details. So I'll explain briefly the cloud infrastructure on which we based our system, then the architecture or the proposed architecture for our system, and how we represent the quality of service attributes. Okay, then the modeling or the criteria, the multi-decision criteria method, and we choose the analytical hierarchy process method to implement it as part of our approach, and the implementation of our system, and finally some of the evaluation and the results. So that's kind of the overall infrastructure of the cloud computing, and there are various issues that part of this infrastructure. But what we are mainly interested is that these are the cloud provider at the bottom layer. Cloud provider or cloud vendor, and then they provide different services using different provisioning model. For example, software as a services, platform as a services, the infrastructure of services. I classify these into this category, but maybe there is some overlap between these. Okay, so our main interest is in the services part. Okay, and then these services are provided using different model. They like called the deployment model. The public cloud, are the services are available publicly, are community-based cloud, the private cloud, or can be combination of some of these or all of these, which is called the hybrid cloud. And the top layer, which are our main work, is that users select the services or service provider by taking into account the quality of service attribute and the service level agreement. So I will not talk much about in this talk about the service level agreement, but it mainly include, of course, major part of the quality of service attribute. But we did include this in our research paper. The next is the architecture of the system which we have developed and implemented for the cloud service selection. It has, again, I show you the component at the high level. The paper provide further details of each of these components. So one thing what we are trying to do is to get the information from the provider to make a decision how to select, how to rank services, because there are different services and they have different quality of service attribute. But of course, the provider, cloud provider, whatever the cloud provider is, each of them will claim that their service is better. Their services has good performance, their services are good security, their services are good reliability, and so on. So that can be quite subjective. So if we just make our decision based on the information provided by the service provider, then maybe it could be subjective. With some of the existing approaches we review, they just only consider these kind of information. So we consider these information, extract or scrape the information from the provider website. We also take into account the second piece of information from the cloud monitoring tool. So there are some monitoring tool, third-party monitoring tool that monitor the performance reliability aspect of various cloud services, okay, online. So we also get information from the monitoring tool. And the third is the cloud user review, that if somebody has to write the review about the cloud services which they already use, then we can get some more most useful information about the cloud. So we got information from 3 different sources, and based on that, we store this information in the databases. We use the analytical modeling techniques, the AHP, the simple additive weighting. We use our quality of service attribute, which are represented, stored as part of our system. And then there is a user interface that can specify their requirement for the quality of service attribute. And then the system recommend, rank, or suggest the services to the user or to the consumer. So one of the major issues is the quality of service attribute. Okay, it may look simple, but actually it's quite complicated. The reason is there is no standard benchmark for representing the quality of service attribute of cloud services. Okay, there are some attempts, but still there is no standard benchmark because there are variation in the way company represent the quality of service attributes about their services. So we try to present or propose a 3-level hierarchical model for representing the QoS attribute of cloud services. And we believe this is useful for people who don't have much knowledge of the cloud services, which we call them novice consumer or user, and also useful for people who have experience of the cloud computing technology. Okay. So I'll explain this later on when we see some of the result. So a couple of examples about how we represent the quality of service attribute like security and performance in 3-level architecture. So the security, okay, security is represented at the high level, or we call it level 1, and then it has other components like access control, data security, geography, the auditability at level 2, and then subcomponent are further granularity at level 3. Access control is divided into authentication, authorization, and similarly data security, encryption, firewall. There are other parameters too. We just added few of them. And similarly, where is the location of the services, the provider location, the machine location, and so on, and some other legal aspect, auditability aspect. Similarly, performance quality of service attribute is represented into 3 levels: the main performance, the second level, the hardware functionality, the flexibility, the scalability, and then the third level with further granularity, the disk operating system, CPU type, and so on. So again, further detail of this is provided in one of our paper, which I listed at the end of the presentation. So people interested in this can read that paper. So we represent these and store them in our system. And the second is, as I mentioned, is to extract the information from 3 different sources. One, for example, is to consider the information from actual provider website, like say Microsoft Azure, how they represent their services. Sorry, somehow my mouse is very soft. This actually is quite challenging problem. It is mainly the problem of information information retrieval research community or web research community. They have designed, developed a useful tool, but here we design kind of simple tool to extract some of the information from the provider website. Because it is challenging because different providers represent the quality of service in different way. For example, price can be in different currencies. Price can be represented as, say, cheap price, expensive, and so on. Similarly, efficiency, performance, reliability, different providers represent them in different way. Then second, we consider the reviews. There are no actually right now, according to our research, standard system for review of the cloud services, unlike other online services like flight, hotel booking, household product, and so on. So these days, some people buy, for example, as to book a hotel, they look at the hotel review system and see what others customers say, which already use or stay in that hotel. Similarly for the flight, similarly for the other product. But cloud services, they don't have so far very appropriate review system. There are some, but not too much. But in the future, if it is developed, the review system for cloud computing, that will provide useful sources of information. So we extract some information from the user review and also some of the information from the service monitor. Like there is the system called the Cloud Harmony or Cloud Square. I hope you can see these slides. It's not very clear, but I just copied from their website. Like say the Google Compute Engine, which area is it? Asia, in Asia East. What is the status? That means maybe it's running. What is the availability? 100%. What is the outage? No outage, no downtime. Okay. So that can also provide quite useful information about the quality of service of the cloud services. So we collected information from different services and then store them in our databases so that they can be used in listing and ranking the cloud services. Then we use the multi-criteria decision-making method. One of them is the AHP, the analytical hierarchy process. There are quite a few of them which can be used. Of course, we use this because this is kind of closely linked to the way we represent the quality of services attribute. So this method takes input about the QoS attribute from the user, for example, performance, security, price, and so on. And then it transfers them to qualitative or semi-qualitative measurement into the quantitative values so that services can be ranked and so on. There are different steps involved in the AHP method. I will not go into these steps. Again, I would suggest to read the paper if you are interested in the different steps. So what actually it provides, like in step 1, user has to compare QoS attributes. For example, if they are comparing services based on the performance and security, then they can assign different values ranging from 1 till 9. So 1 is low, 9 is high. So if they compare, for example, security over performance, they can give high rating to the security and less to the performance. Then there are different mathematical kind of notation, modeling or matrices that are used to represent and to model all these services. So again, I will skip them. The final part is the implementation of the system, which we have designed based on the work we have done. I presented so far. So the system has many components I show you, but from user point of view, it has the user interface, which user can use to specify their requirement for the quality of services of the cloud services. Then the server side that actually implement all the application logic, the AHP method, the QoS attribute, and other aspects. And the databases which store all the information about the whole system. We then hosted this system in the Amazon AWS EC2 server, which is the virtual server, with using the C5X large with the processor of Xeon Platinum CPU 3.0 gigahertz with 8 GB memory, hard disk of 320 GB, and so on. And we use the NoSQL MongoDB, which is quite efficient performance-wise, which is we used in big data applications. So I'll show some of the result. Number one, we done one of the evaluation empirically that by taking into account these four providers, the Oracle, Rackspace, IBM, and Fujitsu, and then we take into account some of the quality of service attribute. Okay, yeah, no problem. Security and performance, etc. So user has to give appropriate ranking, and what the system does, it calculates the score and then it ranks the services according to the score. As you can see, Oracle is scored rank at the top, then the Rackspace and CM. Okay, and at the bottom is the graphical representation of this score. The other aspect which we did which is more useful to the user, is we develop this user interface that user can use this interface to assign different score, for example, to the security parameter, to the usability, to the performance. So if the user doesn't know much about the underlying parameter, they can just score the security, the top layer, okay, that one. If the user has more experience, they know in the underlying feature principle of the cloud, then they can go to the further detail. So each of them, they rank it, score it using this interface. And then when they submit the information, the system does all the calculation based on the technique methods I presented. And then they provide the listing and ranking. Okay. So there is a long list of ranking, for example, and this is the Google Cloud, then Microsoft, and so on. So that make things kind of much easier for the people or the user to see the ranking of the cloud services, and then they can list them. In academic research, there are not much tools like the one we developed, but there are a couple of commercial tools we come across, like the Rights Cloud, the Cloud. You can see further detail, but again, it's not clear what kind of algorithm they use, how they represent the quality of service attribute, and so on. So you can see these on the website, okay, if you are interested in it. So finally, I will talk about some of the future research direction that if the cloud service selection technique, method, solution, they are further developed, then they not only they can simplify the cloud service selection problem, but it can help in other direction. It can open new direction in the cloud computing research. For example, like utility services, switching between different cloud provider. Okay, like this is in UK use switch. If people has to switch from one company to another, if they want to switch their gas, their water, their electricity, it's quite flexible. They just go to their website, they specify their requirement, they choose the provider they want to switch to, and then they're switched. So if the cloud service selection are further developed, then the switching of the cloud services from one provider to another provider will be quite easy and quite smooth. Similarly, cloud broker can use such system, and they can help and advise people if some company individual want to move their IT services to the cloud, then they can use such cloud service selection system or tool to select services and to make a suggestion, recommendation to the cloud user, to the cloud consumer. So finally, these are the paper we have published as part of this work. So if you want to know more detail about it, you can read this paper. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mohammed Younas, for this brilliant presentation and easy to understand. Very easy to understand.
Thank you very much.
Questions from the attendees. 3 components: the cloud user reviewers, the provider website, and the cloud monitoring tool to scrape the data and then analyze it. My question is about the missing data. I mean, while I understand that, for example, the provider website's data is available, and also maybe the cloud monitoring tool, but the reviewer, the cloud user reviews might not be available. How is that taken into account in the initial design of the AHP process you are using?
It's very, very useful question. I fully understand the issue that we try, because we included some of these resources and some of these providers for which we can get some of the data. But again, for many of them, this data is missing. That either we get some data from the provider website, or from the monitoring tool, or from the user. The user review is kind of the more weak in data. As I mentioned, there are not many user review. But we included that, yes, if this part is developed further in future, then it will be quite useful source of information. But
Okay,
yes, there are issues with the missing data, but we had some data for an experiment, so on which we base this few experiment to make the decision or the ranking of the services.
And which NLP tools are you using for the reviewers, if you are using any?
Sorry, which one?
Which NLP?
Oh, well, we use actually we use the PHP, design our own scraper, so we didn't use ready-made tools. Yeah.
Okay, I see.
But of course, I mean, and there are other tools available. The NLP one, the information extraction one, can use it.
And my second question is about the fact that you hosted your system on Amazon Web Services. Doesn't that favor, the ranking for Amazon Web Services?
Well, as you would have seen it in the couple of experiments I showed, the Amazon was not listed in the top. So that will help you answer your question. Second, of course, the Amazon doesn't know what we are implementing there. So there is kind of no aspect of favoring Amazon. Okay. But yeah.
One question from the Q&A, why you choose the AHP method?
Well, that's a good question. There are many of the methods available, part of the MCDS, as I mentioned, the AHP we chose because it's kind of fit the hierarchical nature of the quality of service attribute we represent, like the 3 level. For example, security at level 1, then further parameter of security at level 2, and then further parameter of security at level 3. But there are some research to actually analyze these different methods. So people interested in this, they can read those papers.
So we thank you very much, Professor Mohammed Younas, for this excellent presentation again. And hopefully you will share your slide with us. And we hope to welcome you in other events very soon.